The Myth of Baucis and Philemon, modern adaptation and translation. In a hilly land called Phrygia, in the steep-sided valley, most of the valley is filled with a dark lake. Besides the lake grow two trees, an oak and a linden, their branches entwined. Hanging from every bough and branch there are ribbons. Long ago, great Zeus, whose temple is in the sky, and Hermes the messenger, heard whispers of the house of rumor, that there was a town at the bottom of a deep-sided valley in the hilly land of Phrygia, where the sacred laws of hospitality were flouted, where strangers weren't welcomed. They decided to see if the stories were true. They changed their shape as the gods can, so to all the world they looked like a pair of fair travelers. They flashed down from the sky into the town one night of a terrible storm. From house to house, they ran in the rain, begging for food, begging for shelter. Every request was greeted with kicks and curses and insults. 100 homes they visited. At last, tired, footsore, hungry, the wet they trudged from side to side, from valley to valley in the town behind them. As they did so, they saw they were approaching a little hut. Standing in front of it was an old woman. This was Baucis. She and her husband, Philemon, had met in this place. He had married her in this place. They'd grown old and white together. Children had never come. They were very poor, but they'd always accepted their plight, and they made so light of it. They were devoted to one another. The only thing in the world they had was their valued goose, who guarded their home. Now Baucis said these bedraggled stranglers approaching, and she hobbled over eagerly. "You, mighty Zeus, whose temple is in the sky, has decreed to anyone who approaches our home in need of food, need of shelter, ought to be welcomed. What we have, we'll share with you. Come inside, now come inside." Zeus and Hermes, disguised as men, had to stoop to enter the hut. They were welcomed warmly by the old man Philemon. He shook them each in the hand. He gave them each a stool to sit on. They sat. The old woman, she blew into the ashes at the bottom of the grate, so they glowed red again. The old man put on his cloak. He hobbled out into the storm to pick some vegetables from his garden. The old woman cut a hunk from their lump of long-cherished pork. She threw it into the pot. The old man threw in the vegetables. They poured on the water, sprinkled some herbs and garlic, and talked about whatever they could, in the hope that they could keep their guests' minds after the long delay before it was time to eat. The old man gave them a beechwood bowl, full of warm water to wash off the dust and grime from the journey. The old woman dragged a table from the shadows to the center of the room, so they could sit around from the time when it comes to eat. One leg was far too short. The table wobbled badly, but she kept a shard of tile for this purpose, and slid it under the short leg. She rubbed the surface of the table with stalks of fresh mint so it smelled fragrant. They sat around it. She gave them things to nibble on while they waited: olives, wild cherries that had been steeped in wine, lumps of cheese and radishes, eggs that had been roasted in the embers. One full jug of wine was all they had. She poured it out carefully between the four of them. They sipped, making it last as long as they could. Then came the stew at last, and after the stew they had nuts and grapes and figs and dates and any slice of honeycomb they had left. All through the meal there was talk, there was laughter, and outside the rain came down in black sheets. The woman Baucis looked at the wine jug. She was sure it had been empty, and yet it was full. She poured it out between the four of them, and still it was filled to the brim. She turned to her husband and whispered, "These are gods. These are the two great Olympians, here in our home. What kind of meal was this to give to the two Olympians? We had no choice. We have to go outside and kill the goose. We will pluck it and roast it in their honor." The husband stood. He smiled at the strangers and shuffled his way out the cottage. Inside, the old woman raised her voice, hoping she could drown out the squawking and honking of the dying goose. But the old man was old. Age had made him slow. The goose could tell something was wrong. He had chased the goose back and forth inside the cottage, but by now the old woman was shouting. In burst the goose. It took shelter behind the strangers, and the two travelers stood. "There's no need for you to kill this creature you love so much. We're gods already, and you've given us far more than we could have hoped for. Old man and woman, follow us now." Puffing and grunting, Baucis and Philemon traveled with the travelers out to the top of the valley, where they reached a ridge. They turned. They sank to their knees in awe. The town at the bottom of the valley had gone. Where it had been is now a dark lake. They turned towards the travelers. They shielded their eyes. No strangers were standing there now. Just Zeus and Hermes, awful in their bright glory. "We have punished this town. Only you were spared. We were touched by the warmth of the welcome of your home. We give you both now a wish. Speak now. Anything you want. Speak now." The old woman spoke first. "Mighty Zeus, transform our home into a golden temple, so that we may worship you there for many years as we have left to live." Zeus bowed his head. "Another wish." It was the old man who took his turn, but it could have been his wife as well. They were of one mind. "Will you make us die together? Will you make us die in the same moment, so we will not have to stand beside her grave, so that she will not have to bury me?" Both of their wishes were granted. For 4 more years, they were a priest and priestess in the Golden Temple. Then, in one early morning, the old man was digging in his garden before the heat of the sun was too fierce. His wife called to him. He saw her standing outside in the temple staring at her feet, and when he looked, her toes had taken root, and brown bark was spreading up her legs. He hobbled towards her, he put his arms around her waist. She put her arms on his back. As they embraced, they could feel the buds emerging from the tips of their fingers. They could feel leaves growing from the bald crown on his head. As the bark spread across their faces, they looked into each other's eyes and said one last time, "Goodbye, my dear one." The lake can still be found now, but the temple is long gone. But beside the lake there is 2 trees, an oak and a linden. Their branches entwined as if they're embracing. Hanging from every bough and branch are ribbons, offerings, and gift left by lovers.